They thought I would sell the land after my husband died. 3 days after we buried Harold, I was standing in my own kitchen when 2 trucks pulled into the driveway. White trucks, company logos on the doors, clean tires that had never tasted Kansas mud. I watched from behind the lace curtain as 2 men stepped out, holding leather folders against their chests like hymnals. They weren't there to offer condolences. They were there to close a deal. The wheat fields behind our house were still, pale gold under a gray February sky. 42 years of marriage had just been lowered into the ground at Pleasant Ridge Baptist, and I was still wearing the black dress from the funeral because I hadn't yet found the strength to sort through my closet. When I opened the door, they removed their hats. "Mrs. Carter," the taller one said gently, "we understand this is a difficult time. We just need to finalize the turbine lease your husband signed." Finalize, signed, turbine lease. The words didn't belong in my mourning. They spoke calmly, confidently, as if the decision had already been made, as if I were simply the widow expected to cooperate. "Your husband assured us everything was in order," the other man added. "We were told you'd likely prefer to sell once things settled." Sell. They said it so naturally, as if I were fragile, temporary, transitional, as if the farm that held my children's first steps and my husband's father's fingerprints on the barn beams was already slipping from my hands. I told them I would review whatever needed reviewing. My voice did not shake. That surprised me. After they left, gravel crunching behind them, I stood alone in the kitchen. The house felt hollow in a way that grief alone cannot explain. That's when I saw it. The Bible, still open on the table, exactly where Harold had left it the morning he was rushed to the hospital. Psalms, I think. He always liked Psalms when he was restless. There was something beneath it. Paper, folded, tucked carefully between pages as if scripture itself were meant to guard it. I sat down slowly. My hands were steady when I pulled the envelope free, but they did not remain steady. Before I tell you what I found inside that Bible, the thing that changed not only my widowhood, but my understanding of my entire marriage, let me ask you something. If you're watching from Kansas or anywhere rural where land means more than money, tell me in the comments what state you're from. And if stories about faith, truth, and quiet strength speak to you, consider subscribing. Because what I opened that afternoon wasn't just paperwork. It was the first crack in a marriage I thought had been solid for 42 years. And it forced me to ask a question I never thought I would at 68 years old. Had I already lost control of my life long before I lost my husband? When I married Harold in the spring of 1979, the wheat was waist high, and the wind never seemed to stop moving across the fields. He was 30, I was 26. We didn't have much beyond the farmhouse his parents had built in the early 60s and 640 acres of inherited land that demanded more work than comfort. But we had certainty. At least, that's what I believed. Life on a Kansas farm doesn't leave much room for fantasy. You measure hope in rainfall inches and grain prices. You measure love in repaired fences and long harvest nights when supper waits on the stove past 9 o'clock. Harold was respected in town. He spoke clearly, shook hands firmly, and quoted scripture without needing to open the Bible. By the time he was 45, he had become a deacon at Pleasant Ridge Baptist. By 50, people were asking his advice about crop rotation and cattle feed investments. I taught Sunday school in the classroom with the cracked linoleum floors and flannel board stories. For 31 years, I showed children how David trusted God and how Ruth stayed loyal. I never imagined my own name would one day feel ironic in my mouth. Our routine rarely changed, up at 5, coffee percolating before sunrise, Harold reading at the kitchen table, me reviewing last month's receipts and entering numbers into the ledger. I handled the bookkeeping from the beginning, not because Harold couldn't, but because he didn't want to. He liked soil. I liked order. It worked. Every loan payment was tracked in my handwriting. Every property tax installment recorded. I knew exactly how much diesel cost each March and how much wheat we'd stored each July. Officially, though, Harold made the decisions. That's how it was presented. That's how I repeated it. If someone at church complimented the farm's stability, I would smile and say, Harold has always been a wise steward. It never occurred to me that wisdom and secrecy could coexist. The first shift was almost invisible. About 6 years before he died, Harold began driving to Wichita more often. He said he was attending agricultural conferences, exploring future opportunities. At first, I was proud of him. Many men his age were slowing down. He seemed energized. Then came the phone calls. He started stepping outside to answer them. When I walked into the room, he would lower his voice slightly, not enough to accuse, just enough to notice. If I asked who it was, he'd say, "Just business." And technically, that wasn't a lie. The bank statements changed next. For decades, they arrived addressed to both of us. Then one month, I noticed the envelope had only his name printed above the address. When I asked about it, he waved his hand dismissively. "Just simplifying things," he said. "You've done enough over the years." There's a particular kind of flattery that feels like appreciation, but functions as exclusion. I didn't recognize it then. I wanted to believe he was protecting me from stress. In truth, I think he was protecting himself from scrutiny. He began speaking more often about expansion, about wind energy, about not leaving potential money buried in the ground. Kansas wind had always been background noise to us, something that bent the wheat and rattled barn doors. To Harold, it slowly became opportunity. "Do you know how much these companies are paying per turbine?" he asked once, eyes bright in a way I hadn't seen in years. I told him I didn't know. He didn't show me numbers. He stopped asking my opinion. Small things followed. Locked desk drawers, a new briefcase I had never seen before, receipts for meals in Wichita that didn't match the conference schedule he had mentioned. I told myself long marriages go through private seasons. I told myself men nearing 70 sometimes need to feel ambitious again. And I told myself trust meant not demanding proof. Looking back, I see how fear dresses itself as faith. The final year before his death was the most distant. He grew impatient when I asked routine bookkeeping questions. "Don't worry about that," he'd say, or "I've got it handled." We had never operated on "don't worry." We had always operated on clarity. But I let the shift pass. Because after 42 years, you don't want to discover that the person sitting across from you at breakfast is carrying a separate map. The Sunday before he collapsed, he stood in church and spoke about legacy, about leaving something meaningful behind, about not settling for small visions. The congregation nodded. So did I. That Monday morning, he left the Bible open on the table. By Tuesday afternoon, he was gone. And by Friday, 2 men in pressed shirts were assuming I would sell the land. What I did not yet know, as I sat in that quiet kitchen staring at the envelope hidden inside Scripture, was how many of those subtle shifts were connected. The Wichita trips, the missing bank statements, the sudden passion for turbines, the impatience, the silence. I had believed our stability was permanent. I had believed my role was supportive, not investigative. And I had believed that faith meant maintaining harmony at all costs. I was about to learn the difference between harmony and avoidance. And I was about to see numbers I had never been shown in 42 years of marriage. The envelope inside the Bible was not thick, but it carried the weight of something irreversible. I unfolded the first document slowly. A revised will, dated 6 weeks before Harold's death, signed and notarized in Wichita. My eyes moved carefully over the language, legal phrasing I had seen before, but never applied to myself in this way. I was granted lifetime residential occupancy of the farmhouse. Occupancy, not ownership. The operational control of 480 acres, the most fertile stretch of our land, had been transferred into a trust. The trustee was not me. It was a financial advisor based in Wichita, whose name I barely recognized from passing conversation. My chest tightened, but I kept reading. The trust required projected revenue benchmarks tied directly to a wind energy development agreement. If those benchmarks were not met within specific timelines, portions of the acreage could be sold to satisfy outstanding loan obligations. Loan obligations. There it was again. I searched the envelope for more pages. There were 3 separate loan agreements, 2 signed solely by Harold, one referencing spousal awareness, but not bearing my signature. I stood up from the table and walked to the filing cabinet where I had kept our records for 4 decades. The older deed copies clearly listed both our names as joint tenants, with survivorship rights. My name had not disappeared from history. So how had it disappeared from control? That afternoon, I drove into town and requested copies of recent filings from the county records office. The clerk knew me. She had watched my children grow up. Her expression shifted as she printed documents. "Some of these were filed recently," she said gently. Recently meant while I was still cooking supper, still teaching Sunday school, still believing nothing fundamental had changed. Back home, I laid every paper across the kitchen table. The lease agreement with the wind company committed 30 years of easement access, turbine placement, underground cabling rights, and revenue distribution structures heavily weighted toward infrastructure repayment during the first decade. Projected income looked impressive on the surface, but projections are not guarantees. Attached to the lease was a development rider. Harold had agreed to partial financing of access road improvements and grid connectivity, assuming turbine installation would proceed on schedule. If installation was delayed, debt servicing remained. If wind output underperformed, revenue adjusted. If benchmarks were not met, the trust authorized land liquidation. Each clause felt like a small door closing. I remembered the extra trips to Wichita, the sudden optimism, the private phone calls. He hadn't been unfaithful to me with another woman. He had been unfaithful to our shared transparency. I felt heat rise behind my eyes, not from grief, but from realization. Had he believed I would oppose him, or had he believed I wouldn't understand? The next morning, I scheduled a meeting with Mr. Langley at the bank. He adjusted his tie when I placed the loan documents on his desk. "These projections were reviewed," he said cautiously. "Your husband believed the wind corridor designation increased long-term land value." "Did he inform you that I hadn't reviewed them?" I asked. There was a pause. "He indicated you trusted his judgment." Trusted. Such a simple word. Trust is holy when shared. It becomes dangerous when used as permission to exclude. I left the bank with copies of amortization schedules. The numbers were precise. Over $320,000 in leveraged commitments tied to expected turbine revenue. If the wind company withdrew or delayed repayment, would accelerate within 5 years. I began sleeping poorly. At church, women hugged me and spoke about widowhood as if it were purely emotional. No one knew I was calculating repayment ratios at midnight. One evening, I opened Harold's desk drawer, the one that had remained locked during his final year. Inside were handwritten notes, estimated turbine placement diagrams, projected yield calculations, and one line written in his familiar block letters, "Prove I can still grow this farm." I sat back in his chair and let that sentence settle. This wasn't greed alone, it was fear. Fear of becoming small. Fear of being remembered as the farmer who maintained instead of expanded. But in trying to prove his strength, he had quietly weakened my security. More documents surfaced. An email thread between him and the wind company representative referencing anticipated widow compliance. Widow compliance. I felt something cold settle inside me. Not rage, clarity. The community pressure intensified subtly. A neighbor stopped by with a pie and mentioned that selling now would simplify inheritance matters. Another suggested I consider moving closer to my son in Oklahoma. The assumption was unanimous. I would step aside. The shame deepened in waves. How had I not seen this building? Had my faith made me passive? Had I mistaken peacekeeping for righteousness? I reread the trust language carefully. One clause stood out, Amendments affecting jointly held real estate required documented spousal acknowledgement under state marital property statutes. There was no notarized acknowledgement bearing my name. That detail was small, but it was not insignificant. I drove home that evening with the sun setting behind the grain silos, casting long shadows across the fields that were still legally mine. For the first time since the funeral, my grief shifted. I was no longer only mourning a husband. I was confronting the truth of a marriage that had carried hidden corridors, and I knew this was only the beginning, because the wind company had already scheduled a follow-up visit, and this time I would not be the quiet widow nodding politely. The night before the wind company was scheduled to return, the house felt heavier than it had since the funeral, not louder, heavier. The Kansas wind moved steadily outside, brushing against the siding like it always had, the same wind Harold had tried to monetize, the same wind that had once been nothing more than background to our lives. I sat at the kitchen table long after dark. The overhead light cast a small circle of yellow across the wood. Everything beyond that circle felt uncertain. The Bible was still there, open, unmoved. For days I had treated it like evidence, like a container of betrayal. That night, I pulled it closer again, not searching for hidden documents this time, just needing something solid under my hands. I didn't flip pages. I didn't search for verses about trust or deception. I simply rested my palms over the paper and let the silence stretch. For 42 years, I had defined myself by steadiness, by keeping peace, by making sure no one ever saw cracks. Now I could see them clearly. The cracks were not in my faith. They were in my silence. "Lord," I whispered into the empty kitchen, "I don't want to punish him. I don't want to shame his memory. I just need to know what is mine to carry and what isn't." The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Nothing supernatural happened, but something shifted inside me. I realized I had been confusing gentleness with surrender. I had believed that questioning my husband would disrupt harmony. I had believed that supporting him meant stepping back from decisions that affected us both. But faith is not the absence of inquiry. Faith is the courage to stand in truth without becoming cruel. I looked around the kitchen, the worn floorboards, the curtain I had sewn myself 30 years earlier, the cabinet handles Harold had installed by hand. This house was not a temporary residence granted by a trust. It was the result of my labor, too, my bookkeeping, my budgeting, my years of stretching thin harvest profits into steady payments. The humiliation I felt was real, but humiliation does not erase contribution. I pulled the deed copy from the stack of papers beside me and traced my name with my finger. Joint tenant. Survivorship rights. The law had not erased me. I had allowed myself to fade into the background of decisions. That distinction mattered. By midnight, I understood something with quiet certainty. I would not sell. Not out of stubbornness, not out of revenge, but because this land represented more than Harold's ambition. It represented my lifetime of discipline. The next morning, I dressed as I always did. Modest skirt, low heels, hair secured neatly at the back of my head. There was no dramatic confrontation. When the wind company representatives arrived, I invited them to sit at the same kitchen table. This time, I had the documents arranged in orderly stacks. "I've reviewed the trust and the lease," I said calmly. "There are procedural deficiencies regarding spousal acknowledgement. Until those are addressed, nothing will be finalized." They exchanged glances. Their tone shifted immediately, from assumption to caution. "We were under the impression—" "I'm sure you were," I replied softly. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply stated facts. By the time they left, promising to consult legal, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not victory, alignment. That afternoon, I drove 40 miles to meet with an agricultural attorney recommended quietly by a neighboring farmer's wife, a woman who, I later learned, had once faced her own financial surprise. His office smelled like old paper and coffee. He read everything slowly, marking margins with a pencil. When he looked up, his voice was steady. "Mrs. Carter, portions of this trust are contestable. Your consent appears legally required for enforceability regarding jointly held acreage. Contestable. Not hopeless. Not irreversible. Contestable." I exhaled deeply for what felt like the first time since the funeral. The attorney explained that challenging the agreement would not require spectacle. It would require precision. Notice letters, formal objections, documented timelines, strategy, not emotion. I drove home that evening with the sun lowering across the fields. For the first time since opening the Bible, I did not feel abandoned. I felt responsible. And responsibility, I realized, is different from burden. Responsibility means you still have agency. That night, I slept. Not peacefully, but steadily. The next phase would not be loud. It would be deliberate. And for the first time in years, I was not reacting to someone else's plan. I was drafting my own. The legal process was not dramatic. There were no courtrooms filled with spectators, no public accusations, just letters, certified mail, carefully worded objections. Within 6 weeks, the wind company's legal department requested a formal review meeting. Their tone was no longer confident. It was cautious. The attorney I hired attended with me. He spoke little, but precisely. He pointed out the absence of notarized spousal acknowledgement required under Kansas marital property statutes for significant encumbrance of jointly held farmland. He highlighted inconsistencies in disclosure language. He referenced case precedent calmly. The representatives listened. They no longer called me widow. They called me Mrs. Carter. That difference mattered. The company ultimately determined that proceeding under contested authority would create prolonged legal exposure and financial delay. The large-scale turbine development was withdrawn, not canceled out of mercy, withdrawn out of risk calculation. The bank, once confident in projected revenue, reviewed the consent gaps tied to collateralization. After quiet negotiation, portions of the loan were restructured. Certain penalty triggers were softened. The trust provisions were amended to reflect my survivorship rights. No one announced these adjustments publicly, but word travels in small towns. People began to understand that Harold's plan had not been as airtight as assumed. I did not speak against him. I did not correct narratives harshly, but when someone said Harold had everything perfectly arranged, I would respond gently, "Not everything. That was enough." I discovered something unexpected during those months. As details surfaced about projections, debt exposure, and accelerated repayment clauses, some of Harold's closest friends grew quieter, not judgmental, reflective. They began admitting he had seemed unusually driven in his final years, restless, determined to leave something bigger. His reputation did not collapse, it humanized, and I began to understand him differently too. He had not been trying to hurt me. He had been trying to outrun aging, trying to prove he still mattered in a world shifting toward corporate agriculture and renewable energy contracts. But fear disguised as vision can cost more than it promises. About 5 months after the funeral, I made a decision of my own. I leased 120 acres, not 480, under terms I personally reviewed line by line. A modest wind easement placed along the far western edge of the property, where turbine placement would not disrupt our primary wheat rotation. Shorter term, transparent payment schedule, joint signatures required on every amendment. The income stabilized debt without surrendering control. I sold 2 older pieces of equipment we rarely used. I reduced operational scale slightly. The farm grew smaller, but it grew steadier, and something inside me grew stronger. One evening, nearly a year after Harold's death, I stood at the edge of the field at sunset. The wheat moved in long golden waves beneath the same Kansas wind he once tried to harness entirely. Now only a single turbine stood in the distance, not a forest of them, just one, balanced, intentional. That night, alone at the kitchen table, I opened the Bible again, There were no hidden envelopes this time, no folded contracts, just thin pages and quiet air. My faith felt different, less concerned with appearances, more rooted in truth. I began meeting with women from church once a month, informal gatherings around coffee and notebooks. We reviewed basic financial literacy, understanding deeds, reading loan documents, asking questions without apology. I told them gently, trust is holy, but clarity is not rebellion. Some cried, some nodded, none judged. If this story has touched something in you, if you understand what it means to discover strength later than expected, are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's continue. A year after the funeral, during the harvest dinner in our church fellowship hall, something subtle changed. No one asked when I planned to sell. They asked about yield per acre. They asked whether wind revenue had stabilized. They asked my opinion. Not my permission, my opinion. I realized then that dignity does not return in a dramatic wave. It settles quietly, like dust after a long drive down a gravel road. I still miss Harold. I still remember the young man who fixed engines before supper and held my hand at county fairs. But I no longer protect an image that was incomplete. I protect the truth. The land is still under my name. The wheat still bends. The house still holds morning light across the same wooden table where I once mistook silence for peace. Redemption did not come from proving him wrong. It came from standing steady without becoming bitter, from choosing clarity over collapse, from understanding that faith does not mean closing your eyes. It means opening them, even when what you see hurts. So let me ask you something. Have you ever discovered that the strength you thought belonged to someone else was quietly your own all along? Tell me in the comments. And if this testimony reminded you that dignity can survive disappointment, subscribe to the channel. Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is remain standing on the ground. Everyone else assumed she would surrender. And sometimes the Bible left open on the table is not a symbol of submission, but the place where courage begins.